you determine whether to represent data with a scatter plot or a line graph? Think about this question during the lesson. Luciana collected data on the number of posts she made each week. How can she determine whether there is a relationship between the number of posts she made each week and the number of new subscribers each week? A scatter plot is an appropriate representation of the data because Luciana is interested if there is an association between the two variables. A scatter plot is a graph in the coordinate plane that shows the relationship between two variables. Consider the data values to determine the scales for the x and y axes. Luciana must look at the data values to determine the scales for the x and y axes. She must decide which variable in the paired data goes on the x-axis and which goes on the y-axis. The x-axis is the variable that is controlled, the number of posts. Because the maximum value of x in the data is 5 and the coordinate grid is 10 by 10, a scale of 1 grid line equals 1 post makes sense for this data. The y-axis is the variable that cannot be controlled, the number of new subscribers. Each grid line equals some number of new subscribers. What value would make the most useful scale for y?
Select your answer.
Because the maximum value of y in the data is 120 and the grid is 10 by 10. 15 is the scale value that makes the most sense. Just like before, Luciana labels every other line. Then, Luciana plots the ordered pairs on the graph. She begins with the first column in the table and plots 1, 40. She does the same for the remaining data. The point 5,120 represents the entry, 5 posts, 120 new subscribers in the table. Luciana can use a scatter plot to determine whether there is a relationship between the two variables.
Luciana collects data about the number of entries and the ages of subscribers who enter the concert giveaway.
So here's the chart or data that she's collected. And the question is, the point that represents the data in the fourth column has coordinates blank and blank. So if we look at the data, the columns, remember, are the part of the table that goes up and down. So these are all columns. Up and down are the columns. Rows go left to right. So vertical are columns, horizontal are rows. So it says the data in the fourth column, so I'm just going to use a different color. The fourth column is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth column will be that column, and so the data that represents, we should remember that when you're graphing, you have an X and a Y coordinate. X comes first, Y is the second number. In most table data, like you see here, by default, X is your top and Y is your bottom numbers. So with that, 13 is your X and 9 is the Y. So the coordinates for the fourth column are 13 and 9.
Determine if a line graph or a scatter plot is more appropriate as a representation of the data based on the context. Graph the data and explain your choice.
Here is the data for the player stats, the number of minutes played, and the number of points scored by the players. So we have in that first column are going to be our X values, and the second column is going to be our Y values. So when you see these points, these are the ordered pairs. Their X's are all here and your Y's are here. So the first one would be 6 and 2. So you would graph the 6, and this particular graph, they skip each line, but if you notice a pattern, they are counting by 2. So 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and then 20. But we need 6. So we know 6 will be here, and we go up to 2. And if you look on the y-axis, you have the numbers counting by 1 for each line. So this first line would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They just still continue the pattern of writing the numbers on every other line. But you still need to notice that even though there's no number here, what that number or that line value is. So all these points here are graphed on the on this graph, and the distribution of the points shows the relationship between the two variables, and a scatter plot is more appropriate as a representation because you are looking for an association between two variables. And the numbers, as you see, are kind of scattered on this graph. Now we have another set of data.
Determine if a line graph or a scatter plot is more appropriate as a representation of the data based on the context. Graph the data and explain your choice.
So again, it's written in 2 columns. The first column is the weeks and the second is the games played. The first column represents your X values. The games played would represent your Y values. So if we were to graph them, you would start with 1 and 2. So 1 would be on our X and then 2 would be on our Y. And then we continue graphing each one of the ordered pairs. And then as you can see, once we look at this data, we are able to connect the dots and create line segments. And so each line segment represents a rate of the change between those two data points. And so a line graph is more appropriate as a representation of the data because you are looking at a variable over a specific interval or period of time.
Determine if a line graph or a scatter plot is more appropriate as a representation of the data based on the context. Graph the data and explain your choice.
Okay, so they have this Desmos chart here, so let's figure this out. All right, so as I mentioned before, we have our columns. First column is minutes played. The second column is the fouls. So these are the basketball fouls by the players. And so my X values are here, my Y here. So every time I graph them, they will come from here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, so I have drawn out the graph. Please excuse the presentation. My pen was not being as cooperative as I would like, but I have graphed all of the points on the from the basketball fouls. So each one of the blue X's, it wouldn't let me do circles, but anyway, so each one of the X's represents each one of these coordinates here from our data. So if you look at our data and how it's presented here, the best choice of representation would be a scatter plot because it is identifying how they interact, how the variables interact together.